My name is Lawrence Nentwig. I have a Master's of Science in Neuroscience, Cognitive Neuroscience, and a Master's of Arts in Psychology. I was working on my PhD in clinical neuroscience until 2013. And in between this time, I was taking care of my wife, and then I ended up having a son. And all of this kind of deviated my path from finishing my PhD. And then afterwards, I became an autism consultant, which I spent probably the last 10 years doing, which is pretty much just helping other parents understand an autism diagnosis and treatment options and education options. A lot of problems arise in the public education system when you're starting to look for accommodations for children on the spectrum, and you need to essentially at this point fully understand the handbooks that they give you. And if you don't read them and you don't know the right language to use, it's really hard to get proper accommodations. And a lot of times schools will just kind of steamroll over that because it's far easier to function on a minimal level and not offer the correct accommodations for some children than it is to actually give them. Once I saw how big of a problem that I had with that, that is kind of what made me go into the autism consulting when I realized how many parents struggle with that. And then also you have the people that struggle when they first get the diagnosis. They don't know where to go with it. And a lot of the time the diagnosis comes young. So when you get a diagnosis for a child, you obviously have a lot of emotions you start going through. And it can become very complicated, and some people just need help to understand what options are, what it means, what life trajectory is going to change, and what expectations they need to change. And they sort of go through a grieving process in a lot of ways. And a lot of them end up having to go to medication, almost all of them. And this is always a struggle for parents, and no parents want to medicate their children. I know I didn't. And I don't think I started until I was 4 or 5, but it became apparent that there were certain things that were unmanageable without medication. And a lot of parents will go years without touching medication because they don't understand it, or they're afraid of it altering the children in some way, not realizing that by not medicating, the behaviors that are happening are so problematic that it's not going to be able to be fixed on its own. So I have a lot of people just contact me and wanting to know about medications and how to medicate their child, what to medicate their child with, what is safe, what isn't safe, what to expect, what not to expect. And those are the primary things that I end up helping most parents out with. Unless I have to go into the schools to be an advocate, some people will call me in to come into an ARD because they don't feel like they have a fair enough say. But I don't really know if it's that or if they just don't know how to communicate, and they feel that with a third party there, the school will listen to them differently. I taught for several years as a PhD student, and then working in the lab. It just sort of, that was the form of communication that had to be used. And if you if you use smaller words that weren't as precise, it would become problematic for relaying data and teaching at the level that the university wanted it to be taught. So the language sort of had to be ingrained into everything that was done at the university. So I think I was just spending way too much time at the university. Since I don't know how many doctor appointments I go to on a regular basis for the kids, therapy appointments, and I found that if I don't use the full body of my language, the doctors will try to kind of just roll over things with the kids. And then I have to get really specific, like, okay, like a doctor didn't want to prescribe a medication for my son. Kind of in this argument about this. So I had to start going into, she was afraid of, the developmental delays that it could cause physiologically. And she just kept repeating it that way. And so I had to start asking her, what neurodevelopmental delays are you expecting or talking about, given the medication that he's already on has already caused numerous modifications in the central nervous system. So what are you worried about? Because I think all of these changes have already been made with other medication. I don't understand what the problem was with one. In a lot of ways, I noticed that the schools will act like they don't know what you're talking about when you try and put it in plain language. Like I'm having this problem and this is supposed to be done and I don't understand why it's being done. Like, oh, that's not our responsibility or we're not supposed to do that. But if you come back and you word it in the language that is all given to you at the start of an art or a special program, they always give you the parent's handbook and then a guide on FERPA, which is essentially the Fair Education Responsibility Purpose Actor. I believe that's what the acronym stands for. But this is extremely important when it comes to understanding how to get what it is that is a fair and appropriate education for your child. And a lot of it is tied to very specific words. One thing that I can remember that it started with me was I want to say it was first grade for my son. And he heard something that he shouldn't know. And it was something that he shouldn't have found out about. It was something that he didn't remember. And one day he came home to me and he asked me if this was true. And I had to tell him, which I had been putting off telling him this piece of information. It was about his mother, and his mother passed away, and he did not know that because he didn't remember. It happened when he was about 3, so his memory was very scarce on it. But he came home one day and he asked me if it was true and was his mom dead and some other very specific facts about her. And I had to go into this long conversation with, yes, it's true. And then I had to have probably an hour-long talk with him because he asked every conceivable question about how it happened, what did she have, would he have it, what are the odds of him having it. And I knew that this could have only come up in one way, and that was it's in his school record, which meant that a teacher or some school staff had read this and then repeated it, not necessarily to him, but where he could hear it. And then I called the school the next day, and I started talking to the principal, and then I started asking him. I wanted to know who had access to those records. It's like, we don't keep anything like that. And I'm like, that's not true. According to all of your documentation and FERPA and your parent handbook, it clearly states that all student records are kept on file and that there's a written log of absolutely anybody who accesses that student's records. And when I said this, his demeanor completely changed. He's like, oh, yeah, you're right. And then he's like, let me see what I can do and find out, who does this. And I'm like, well, according to your records, there has to be one person at the school who is designated as the person who keeps these records, as well as the person who has to log who accesses these records. And he was like, yeah, I know. Let me try and figure it out. This particular problem I never solved, and they could never give me the names. Now, the problem is I know that they had them, but they wouldn't tell me who had access to them outside of the teachers that I know that he had. So to me, it had to have come from those people, but they still tried to play a game. I don't know what you're talking about. We don't do anything like that. And, it's perfectly evident that that's where it came from. There was no other way, no other place. And I wanted to know who, because this became a totally different issue, just saying it. And by knowing their regulations and their guidelines, I forced him to admit that they had to keep a log of it and that they had to know it. And then when he told me that when he finally got back to me, it was like, we don't have a log. And I'm like, but you're supposed to keep a log. And he was like, we don't have one. I'm like, so you're telling me you're breaking the law? And he said, yeah. I mean, he kind of fumbled around it, but that's essentially what he said. But I had to force him to do it by using everything that I knew from the parent's handbook and all these guidelines, regulations to understand what it is that they're required to do, especially with sensitive information, especially if it's a kid with a disability and sensitive information. So that's just one example of how knowing very specific language helped me pretty much obtain the answer that I needed to know. It didn't give me the answer directly because they were going to hide that and cover for the person, but it did force them to admit someone had accessed it, but couldn't tell me who, and that they weren't keeping a log. So I think after that point, they started becoming a real stickler for details and information gathering.
This is, I guess, less important because you never got an answer. But like, I'm so curious, like, why anyone in the world would need to go and find out that information.
Gossip was the only thing I could figure. It was gossip. That's all it could have been.
Are there other schools that both your kids went to? I don't know, had to change schools a lot, or was there
Yeah.
just kind of one?
In I think it was second grade. Noah was fine because he moved around a little bit. He started pre-kindergarten. He was in daycare a couple of times. One with an individual, an old lady that watched kids for years. And I didn't trust it until he was about a year and a half. I was always paranoid of him being away from me, so he did everything with me. I would literally take him to school with me, and if I had to teach, he was strapped to me, and I was teaching to college students with a baby. And then when he got into pre-K in public school, the first pre-K was good, no problems. At least son that popped up. And then after that, I moved to Nashville, and because of his age, he went back into pre-K again. So he did another full year of pre-K, and then he did kindergarten in Nashville. And in Nashville, there were absolutely no problems. The school system seemed to be really progressive and really on top of, kids on the spectrum and being cognizant of what needed to be done and how to do things. And then after kindergarten, we moved back to Texas. When we moved back to Texas, and he went into first grade, that's when the problems started, with just simple bullying things and problems popping up where didn't have the right support in school. At first, they tried to just matriculate him into your general ed classroom. Because of his IQ, he's so smart that you give him a test, he can go right through it. And technically, he should be in gen ed or, probably a grade above. But the gen ed classroom just doesn't fit him because, there's 15, 20 kids. And then when he starts acting out, it's hard to deal with it or answer a question or. So eventually got him into the special programs, but that's when all these weird problems started coming up with information he shouldn't know and bullying. It got to the point where I was at the school every day talking to the principal about one problem or another.
Mm-hmm.
And by second grade, I was like, I can't take this anymore. So I had to pull him out and I put him in a private school. And it was a private school that was supposed to be geared towards kids on the spectrum. And I say supposed to be because it was very expensive. And the way that it was billed to me was they targeted, kids on the spectrum. They found what their gifts were and they expanded on them and they helped them grow and thrive around other children that were like them. And this school is very expensive for, he went there half of second grade, third grade, and fourth grade, and then part of fifth grade. And each year is like $26,000. It was an extremely expensive school. And I always enjoyed doing, it was amazing. In the first year or the first half of a year, I was still, extremely overprotective from my experience from public school. So I forced kind of getting into the school. Like every field trip, every little chance that I had to get in, I would go inside the classrooms and see what he was doing. And they seemed to be doing exactly what they said. And by the second year, they started imposing all these privacy rules and saying I couldn't go on field trips. They didn't allow parents to come on field trips, and I couldn't come into the classroom and I couldn't observe the classroom. This one made me a little bit nervous, but I can kind of understand where they were coming from in regards to HIPAA regulations, because I was seeing kids, obviously by seeing the other kids, I knew that they were on the spectrum. So this worked. And so for 2 years, I let him go. I didn't really see much growth, but he already went in 2 or 3 grades above where he was at academically.
Wow.
But every meeting that I had there, I always pushed with them that I wanted them to challenge him academically because he really needed to grow those skills that were already exceptional in him. And that was one area to target. And they essentially didn't. They didn't teach anything. It seemed like what eventually it became was a school that managed children that couldn't be managed anywhere else. Now, this wasn't what it was billed as, but I think by that second year he was in there, the majority of the clients became kids that fall more under the ED disorder, emotionally disturbed. So they just had massive problems. and they wouldn't be accepted anywhere else. And I think this school eventually began to cater to those kids, and the bulk of the kids became that. So they spent most of their time dealing with massive problems that were popping up with these kids and not really pushing education on the kids who didn't have serious problems like they were supposed to. It was like, you're doing okay here, just do this work since you can sit there quietly, just do your work. And then you can have free time when you're done. So it was really like they weren't doing it. It was like $26,000 daycare is essentially what it became.
At what point in his time there did you figure out like they were just kind of watching the kids, managing them and sending them home?
Sometime in the middle of third grade. And it was because we had meeting with the counselors and the teachers once every 3 to 4 months. And then keep in mind at the time I was a single parent. So it was always just me and Noah. So I would be the only one going to the meetings. So I heard absolutely everything. And every time that I went into these meetings, I'd be like, what are you doing to challenge his gifts? Because, I want you to be pushing him, 1 or 2 grades above the technical academic work he should be doing, because he's already there and you need to be challenging him. And I was always assured, yes, we're challenging him. It was hard for me to gauge whether or not that happened because he was already so smart. So it would be hard to see an improvement with him at home. And he didn't tell me about what goes on during the day. And I still get that now. He's in 8th grade and, he's going into 8th grade. And when he comes home, I'm like, how was your day? And he's like, it was fine. I'm like, what'd you do today? I don't know. Like, what'd you study today? I don't know. What'd you do? I don't know. Like, what was the last class that you had? I don't know. What was your favorite class today? I don't know. Could you tell me one thing that you did today? I ate lunch. I'm like, okay. And it's like with both of the kids here, they're like that. And you ask them what happened during the day, and like, I don't know. And I don't know if it's either they don't know, they don't want to talk about it, or it's like they get home and there's like, I don't want to think about that anymore. So it's really hard information in that department. So that's why it was really hard to pick up what was going on at private school. It wasn't until I moved him back into public school that I saw there was a gap. And the gap was far more visible with Bela when Bela moved because they both kind of moved to public school at the same time. And with Bela, it was very apparent that she hadn't learned anything in that time at the school. And Noah went in pretty much at grade level because he went back in, it's like the very, very end of 4th grade, beginning of 5th grade. And it was apparent he struggled with some things, but he was still right on level. He just struggled with the social aspect of it and far more children and all the noise and all the different things that you have to deal with. But right after that, COVID also hit. So then we had like a year and a half or so of no school for both of them. And it was all just homeschool. And while I was helping both of them, it was apparent Bela was really, really far behind. And Noah was struggling more in some areas than he should. And all of this should have been addressed at the private school, which, of course, it wasn't. So that's pretty much how we discovered that the private school wasn't doing anything. And afterwards, it turns out almost all of the parents pulled their kids out. During COVID, I think they tried to do some type of virtual learning, but other parents, would have to sit in on all of it. And the few parents that I knew that kept their kids there after that, or during the COVID period, like the first year of COVID, almost all of them sued the school because they saw virtually what it was they were teaching them, and it wasn't anything. And I don't know how they figured they could hide this when parents are going to have to be sitting in with their children trying to do work. And they really didn't have much of a curriculum at all.
It's silly to think, like, who is the one person in this situation that the school shouldn't be trying to fool? The parent. The parents who have to know every little detail about their kids' attitude and the behaviors and what to expect. They're always there, having meetings. The people that are in charge of these children, they're supposed to be looking out for their well-being, are usually not, they don't know enough.
Like in the public education system, I understand that there are certain limitations, and then you have paraprofessionals who they're supposed to be helping in certain situations, but they don't have the background knowledge to understand how to deal with certain behaviors, or how to handle certain things, and they are just kind of thrust into it. And they might not receive the type of training that they need in order to effectively manage or reach these children. Because the one key thing with any kid on the spectrum is you have to figure out how to reach them before you can teach them. And that can become somewhat complicated because it varies from kid to kid how you can reach them and make a connection. But once you do that, you can teach them and, get them to learn effectively and get them to listen to you. It just takes a lot of, practice and experience.
It literally sounds like you have to go to court as your own
lawyer. It essentially is. And a lot of parents are intimidated by that, especially single parents. I was kind of immune to it because I got used to it really, really early. And going to these meetings, and it was like me against 5 people. I had like a principal and then like an assistant principal and then some kind of administrator and then 2 or 3 different teachers. And all of their best interest is aimed at the school and at, spending as little time in this meeting as possible to get through it as fast as possible because it takes up part of their day. And a lot of it, I don't blame them, but I guess it's just a side effect of public education in and of itself. Teachers aren't really trained and aren't qualified.
So are your options public education and charter school?
It's public education, charter schools, and private schools.
Okay.
And private schools generally have a very hefty price tag. They're pretty much unregulated, and it's pretty much just left up to the owners of the business, which is what any private school is a business, is to generate a profit. So most private schools, even though they're usually billed as we can help your children, they don't end up turning out that way. And it's more of, okay, no other school will take your children. We'll take them. Here's the price tag. And we'll watch after them. We'll make sure they're safe. But, as far as education, not really our responsibility. And there are a couple of them. It's just to weed through them is almost an impossible task for anybody. And the best way is if you know somebody who has a child who went somewhere and they have direct experience with those schools is really the only way to get accurate information on how they function, because you can't really do the research on your own and pull anything off the internet because it's all bias generated towards a business and generating revenue for a business. I wish that it wasn't that way, but it seems like given the rising increase in number of cases of children with autism, there seem to be lots and lots of schools and businesses and centers that are opening up, all on the premise of we can help your child. But here's the price tag.
Yeah, that happened a lot over COVID, correct? There are a lot more diagnoses. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And they predicted during COVID that it would cause a drastic rise in developmental delays, which they have. The CDC in over a 43 increase in different developmental delays. Autism is one of them, but also speech problems and cognitive delays, all based on the social isolation that came with COVID. If you have a kid with autism and it's completely isolated to just people in the home, it causes an even further delay and sets them back even further. Much more so than I think anybody thought. Not that anybody had ever experienced anything like this before, but the CDC knew that it would cause an increase in developmental delays.
I want to know more about how your work and your background plays into the advocacy that you do for parents. You were joking earlier that you have a lot of science language, and not everyone that comes into being an advocate goes that route as far as studies go. They do human services or something like that.
Well, a lot of it is even simple things like what is autism? And, you're going to get probably a slew of different responses. And most people will say it's a developmental delay. Parents will go, what does that mean? What is that? What is a developmental delay? What is the fundamental difference that's causing autism? And essentially what it is the neuroplastic disorder. It has somewhat of a genetic basis. We don't fully understand the genetic component to it, but what it does is it changes the brain. and it makes the individuals have probably 50 to 60% more white matter. So 50 to 60% more neural connections that the brain is trying to make. While you're growing as a baby, you develop all these neural connections, and there's a lot of them. And then over time, as a normal person develops, these connections slowly connect to, whatever specialized areas they need to. So, one for vision, one for thoughts, one for, walking, one for cognition, one for whatever your special interest in, one, whatever it is that you like, one for social interaction. And they all refine themselves and kind of meet the targets. What we find in autism is that post-mortem, when they do in studies, what they found is there's far more of these neural connections, and at least 50% of them don't actually have a connection. They're just kind of free-floating pathways. And this kind of creates a problem. This is kind of theory at this point, because you go with what cognition is and how it functions and how, neural connections can influence someone's perception of things. These kids have far more connections and far more neural connections that aren't actually connecting, that their brain is trying to process 100 times more information than your average person. And this causes this delay. And it's because they have to sort through all this excess information that's created by these extra neural pathways that really shouldn't be there.
Is it like a dead end if these neural pathways that form but aren't connected to anything? It's the messages are being sent and these connections are being made, but every now and again it's just hitting it.
Kind of.
Some of these messages are hitting. Okay.
Kind of. That is a good way. It's like you have the neural pathways that made their connections for whatever specialized purpose they have. And then you have ones that don't. They're just kind of dead ends. So these connections, whenever something is fired on them, they don't ever hit a target. So you've got all this excess energy and activity in the brain that isn't really doing anything. So when you have this happening, you have things what you would end up calling a developmental delay, because maybe the speech isn't quite right, or maybe the emotional connections aren't right. Maybe they struggle with just being around other people. It also creates, special gifts, like making them super intelligent, or having super acute senses. But in other terms, it causes massive delays and massive problems that we can't solve. There's no way to turn off this excess activity in neuroplasticity. And before COVID, it was 1 in 53, I think, for the statistics. 1 in 53 children would be affected by autism in some form or other. But technically, it is evolution. It is, since autism is essentially a genetic mutation, that in and of itself is evolution by definition. And you can look at it in that way and think of most of the problems that the children or adults have with autism. It seems to be kind of disconnected from society. Don't really much care about peer interactions. That's not so important. It's processing information, learning, focusing in on special interests. And if you think about, say, the last 20 years or so, just in the last, say, 2 decades, the world has changed drastically when you consider that we are all being bombarded by information all the time. We have the internet, we have TV, we have the radio, and at any point in any time, you can get up and you can look up anything. You're surrounded by information. You're never not surrounded by information. And most of these kids have an uncanny ability of processing large amounts of information. So it does seem like our society is moving towards processing large amounts of information. Social interactions aren't so important, and their brains are developing to process the information as opposed to the social interactions, because most of the delays have to do with social interaction. And in a way, it could be evolution.
Again, going back to like your focus in the sciences, what is the field studying, doing, trying to attempt in regards to researching more on autism?
There haven't been a whole lot of new theories. What they're still focusing on is, what is the root cause? Can you predict it? Is there a way to predict it or to figure out what it is that's causing it? Is it something in the environment? Is it something that people are eating? Is it something they're just being exposed to in another way? Is it just the environment, period? They're really trying to focus in on what is causing these increases and rises. That's where most of the research seems to be done. We have all the research about essentially what it's doing, and that's not still complete. We just know one physical aspect really, and that is there's a drastic increase in white matter, which is just neural connections in the central nervous system. So we know concretely that it's a neuroplastic disorder. But as to what causes it, we're still somewhat dumbfounded scientifically. I guess it would be too hard to isolate what it is that's causing the change. You have too many factors. And like just the stuff that's changed in the last 2 decades would drastically influence anything. The availability of the internet, the bombardment of information, constant cell phone signals, and you're being bombarded with everything all the time. And all of this stuff is just stuff that's come about in the past 20 years. Now, autism didn't just develop in the last 20 years. It's just started drastically increasing. And we still don't know if that is an interplay of the environment, or is it that we're just getting better at spotting it? It might be that it would have to be an interplay of the environment over getting better at spotting it. I mean, I know we have gotten better at identifying it and making diagnosis and spotting the condition itself, but there's still something else going on outside of our knowledge of it. We're still having the possibility that the condition itself is being overly diagnosed just based on certain criteria that could be associated with something else. Because a lot of times you have so many different comorbid conditions going on, especially if you have some kind of brain problem or a brain injury or some other pathology that's really wrong. And you go to get a diagnosis and they're kind of dumbfounded as to what it could be. But hey, you repeat your hand movement or something. You're constantly flapping your hands. You're engaging in a repetitive behavior of some kind, or you have a special interest that you talk about all the time. And this in and of itself would warrant an autism diagnosis. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's autism. It just means that according to this book, that diagnostic criteria was met to get the diagnosis.
So these are the descriptors in that book.
Right.
It sounds like a casting call.
All the diagnostic criteria and the criteria for making a diagnosis are all contained within these manuals, and this is where it's all coming. So it's a universal standard at this point. I think there's a variant somewhere in Europe, but it's pretty much the same thing. And if those criteria are met, and it's not even all of them, I think it's only like two or three out of like 6 or 7, if those are met, for diagnosis. But this is how the scientific community, even with any mental illness, it's all based on diagnostic criteria laid down in a manual. And if those criteria are met, you have that diagnosis.
You do have the experience of raising a child that's on the spectrum. So that puts you in that position to want to help other people. But why did you decide that you want to help families?
I had so much information available to me, just based on everything that I had learned in raising a child with autism, and I saw how difficult it was. And very early on, I was, doing most of it alone, and I understood the stress that it could cause other parents, even not just single ones, but your traditional atomic family. And I wanted to help to make things easier for people to understand the diagnosis and to not over catastrophize is one word that comes to mind, because a lot of times when parents get the diagnosis, they think it's the end of the world, that they have this vision in their head of this perfect little child that's going to grow up, and they have all these expectations of what they're going to be, what they're going to do. And then they get this diagnosis and all of that changes. And then they have no idea. And then everything that they wanted kind of becomes moot. And they're afraid of losing that ideal vision that they had in their head. And I started doing this, trying to help people so that they didn't so much catastrophize, and so that they realized it wasn't really the end of the world. and that it's difficult, but it can be rewarding as well. And if you only look at one side, you only see one side. And if all you want to see is something negative, that's all you're ever going to see. And some people just need help to see things through a different viewpoint.
You're making a wonderful argument that knowledge is power in these kind of situations. I mean, emotionally, it is overwhelming, and I can only imagine, going through life, dealing with those ups and downs. But what you've brought to these other parents and such is something that I don't think a lot of people immediately jump to when they first get a diagnosis. Like they're shocked. Their expectations, if they had them in the first place, are shattered.
Well, very much so. And though when you go, what I've noticed with most parents, when they get that autism diagnosis, they go through what is essentially very, very similar to the 5 psychological stages of grief. And it's almost identical. If you look at it, what they experience and the way they feel things, they go through these 5 stages, the denial, acceptance, arguing or bargaining, resentment, and anger. It doesn't necessarily have to follow that order, but they all pretty much go through the same thing. And it doesn't really have to be that difficult, because it might not be the end of the world. You're just going to have to reframe your idea a little bit. It's not going to be the picture you had in your head. It's going to be the picture that you had.
What do you hope to see, if you're a hopeful person, to see in the future of either the science and study of autism or in the treatment in the public education system?
I guess the most promise would be change into the education system that most children are involved in. There are a lot of children who aren't, and some parents will just pull their kids out of school and we'll just do homeschool because, it beats all of the problems, but it really doesn't, because if you're doing homeschool with a kid on the spectrum, you're there all the time. You can't walk away. Like during COVID, I could not leave my son's side. I mean, I had to sit there and go through everything with him. And if I had to go sit and work on my own for 5 minutes, you just look back and he was not doing anything he was supposed to. He was completely off on whatever it was he wanted to do. So when you're homeschooling, that's one thing you have to keep in mind, is you always have to be there. And that the public education system doesn't always have to fail. It can succeed. It's just going to take education and certain legislation to pass. So my big hope is to see reform in these systems. And I'm sure most of it would have to be a political reform of some kind to trickle down to the education system, since most of the education system is based on legislation that's passed for just education in general. It's not targeting a specific population. And it would be really hard to target a specific population given you have everything. Where do you start drawing the line? Okay, we have to train you on autism. We have to train you on ADD. And then, okay, well, there's all these mental illnesses. We're going to have to train you on that too. And then, okay, well, there's all these physical disabilities you might have to deal with. They're going to train you on that too. So it becomes like a fine line of how can you accommodate without opening this door to overloading the system with trying to accommodate absolutely any deviation that could possibly happen.
If there's anything you could tell the students and the educators and other professionals watching, about whether they're interested in working with kids on the spectrum or have more questions, what would you want them to know from the heart?
Just to educate yourself, not only on one basic definition of what autism is, but on the huge variations that there are, and to be patient with children on the spectrum. If you're trying to reach them, if you're trying to teach them, if you want to help them, just be patient and take the time to make an interpersonal bond with the child or adult or whoever it is, because that makes a huge difference in your ability to reach them. And this varies from person to person, but if you take that time, you will be able to reach them and you will see change in therapy or schoolwork or problem behaviors. You just have to take the time to make that connection.
Special thanks to our guest, Lawrence Nentwig. Are you or someone you know interested in joining us at the roundtable? Connect with the team at info@nationalhumanservices.org. You can find all our roundtable conversations on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the iHeartRadio app. Be sure to follow us on social media and check out our website for everything NOHS.